in the world's most volatile regions. War is often seen in terms of missiles, tanks, and territorial maps. But beyond the smoke and rubble lies a quieter, deeper battle, one that rages not on the ground, but inside the human mind. The Iran-Israel-U.S. conflict is not just a clash of nations or ideologies. It is a war that leaves scars far beyond borders, silently rewriting the lives of those caught in its storm. This is a war of psychology, the invisible battleground where fear, trauma, and power collide. Ladies and gentlemen, when we think of war, we often imagine the roar of fighter jets, the flash of explosions, and the haunting silence that follows destruction. But what we rarely pause to consider is the psychological cost of conflict, the invisible damage that lives on long after the last bomb falls. Today, I invite you to journey with me inside that hidden battlefield, inside the war psychology of the Iran-Israel-U.S. conflict, a war where minds are both the targets and weapons. In the shadows of this geopolitical struggle, millions of minds are shaped, shaken, and scarred. In Iran and Israel, and in places touched by America's decisions, ordinary people wake up each day to uncertainty. Sirens that pierce the night don't just warn of missiles. They condition the mind to live in a state of constant alertness. For children, the sound of sirens replaces lullabies. For parents, each new dawn brings a silent prayer that their loved ones will survive the day. This is a psychological environment in which war embeds itself. Deep within the consciousness of people, fear becomes more than a reaction. It becomes a way of life. In war zones shaped by the Iran-Israel-U.S. dynamic, fear teaches people when to hide, when to run, when to stay silent. And over time, this fear rewires the brain. It can create hypervigilance, where the smallest sound feels like a threat. It can plant seeds of distrust, of neighbors, of strangers, even of one's own thoughts. This is no accident. Fear, in these conflicts, is often deliberately cultivated. When leaders speak of enemies at the gates, when media broadcasts images of destruction 24/7, when propaganda paints the other side as monsters, all of this fuels a psychological war that is just as devastating as any physical attack. And who suffers most in this mental battlefield? The civilians, especially the young. Imagine, for a moment, being a child in a city targeted by missiles. Imagine learning to identify the difference between the whine of a drone and the whistle of an incoming rocket before you even learn the alphabet. Imagine carrying that fear day after day until it becomes part of your identity. These children, whether in Tel Aviv or Tehran, or in communities influenced by America's military strategies, grow up shaped by conflict. Their dreams, their sense of safety, their ability to trust, all distorted by the shadow of war. But it doesn't stop with fear. The trauma of living through conflict embeds itself in memory. It forms the silent companion of millions. A father who flinches at the sound of fireworks because they remind him of gunfire. A mother who cannot sleep, haunted by the images of destruction. A teenager who struggles to form relationships because, in their mind, the world is not a safe place. This is the deep, enduring damage of war psychology. And it is damage that does not respect borders, because trauma ripples outward, from Gaza to New York, from Jerusalem to Washington. The decisions made by nations, the policies shaped in government halls, create psychological shockwaves felt in homes, schools, and communities far beyond the front lines. Ladies and gentlemen, the Iran-Israel-U.S. conflict is often described in terms of winners and losers, strategic victories and losses. But in the realm of the mind, there are no victors, only those who struggle to rebuild what war has broken. And rebuilding is not easy, because unlike shattered buildings, the human mind does not reveal its cracks so clearly. A damaged psyche may look whole on the surface, but inside it carries fractures that can take generations to heal. This invisible war, the war of psychology, is the true legacy of conflict. And unless we recognize it, unless we address it with the same urgency as we address weapons and treaties, we will never achieve lasting peace. For peace is not just the absence of violence. It is the presence of safety, of trust, of hope. And these are qualities that must be rebuilt in the minds of those who have lived through war. In the Iran-Israel-U.S. conflict, the psychological battlefield may be hidden, but its effects are everywhere. In the silent tears of a refugee, in the sleepless nights of a soldier, in the guarded hearts of communities shaped by years of tension. And so, as we look to the future, we must ask ourselves, are we ready to fight for peace not just on the ground, but within the human spirit? Because that is the battleground where the longest war is fought and where the greatest victory can be won in modern conflict. Fear has evolved from being a natural response to danger into a deliberate weapon of war. In the Iran-Israel-U.S. dynamic, fear is no longer just a reaction to violence. It is engineered, amplified, and used to shape human behavior on a massive scale. War psychology today is not limited to the battlefield. It operates in minds and societies, quietly reshaping how people think, feel, and act. Fear as a weapon functions silently, but effectively. It does not destroy buildings, but it destabilizes lives. In conflict zones touched by the Iran-Israel-U.S. struggle, fear is planted through multiple channels. Through sirens that tear the night, through the constant hum of drones in the sky, through media images that replay scenes of destruction over and over. Each siren conditions people to expect the worst. Each image deepens a sense of vulnerability. Over time, this environment of fear changes how people think and feel. It creates hypervigilance. It distorts judgment. It narrows the ability to hope or imagine peace. Fear serves many purposes in war psychology. For governments, it becomes a tool to justify action or inaction. When fear is widespread, populations become more accepting of harsh policies, military responses, and restrictions on freedoms. People look to authority for protection. They are less likely to question decisions that might otherwise seem extreme. The fear of attack, of invasion, of annihilation is used to secure support, not just for defense, but for aggression. And because fear is invisible, its use as a weapon often goes unnoticed. Propaganda plays a crucial role in constructing and spreading this fear. In speeches and statements, the enemy is often described in exaggerated or dehumanizing terms, not as a group with its own history, grievances, or humanity, but as a monstrous force that must be defeated at any cost. In the Iran-Israel-U.S. context, this portrayal fuels cycles of hatred and mistrust. It solidifies divisions, making dialogue harder and conflict more likely. Media outlets, whether intentionally or not, reinforce these narratives by focusing primarily on violence, danger, and destruction. The result is a population caught in a constant state of psychological alert, ready for war, unable to envision peace. America's role in the psychological landscape is complex and significant. As a global superpower, every policy decision, military move, and public statement from the United States sends psychological signals across the region and the world. When the U.S. shifts troops, deploys aircraft carriers, or forms alliances, it influences not only military balance, but the emotional and mental state of millions of people. These moves can heighten fear among civilian populations, embolden some groups, and terrify others. The psychological impact of American involvement reaches beyond the region, shaping global perceptions of security, justice, and power. Fear does not stay confined to places where bombs fall or sirens sound. Through news reports, social media, and political narratives, it spreads far beyond borders. People in distant countries absorb this fear and form opinions based on it. They react not to personal experience, but to the images and messages carefully constructed and distributed in the psychological battle. In this way, fear becomes a global force, one that influences elections, foreign policy, and community relations in places far removed from the immediate conflict. The use of fear as a weapon comes at a deep cost. It creates a population that is divided, anxious, and suspicious. It limits the ability of societies to think critically, to ask hard questions, or to challenge the status quo. Fear turns neighbors into potential threats. It transforms communities into isolated, defensive units. It breeds intolerance and makes peace harder to achieve because trust is so badly eroded. And once fear takes root, it is difficult to remove. It lingers in the mind, shaping attitudes and decisions long after the conflict is ended. The psychological harm caused by this deliberate cultivation of fear does not only affect those directly involved in the conflict, refugees, displaced families, children growing up amid tension, all carry the weight of this mental war. Even soldiers and decision makers are not immune. Fear shapes their choices, limits their vision, and sometimes pushes them toward actions that deepen the conflict rather than resolve it. Ultimately, the psychology of fear in war teaches a dangerous lesson: that survival depends on constant suspicion, that strength lies in aggression, and that peace is an illusion. But this lesson is not inevitable. Awareness is the first step toward breaking the cycle. When people recognize how fear is used, how it is planted, spread, and manipulated, they can begin to resist its grip. They can seek out information beyond propaganda. They can question narratives that rely on fear rather than reason. They can choose, even in difficult circumstances, to act with courage rather than panic. The true challenge in modern conflict is not simply to win battles on the ground. It is to win the battle for the mind, to build resilience, to foster understanding, and to resist the forces that seek to divide and control through fear. The path to peace is not paved with weapons. It is paved with knowledge, with empathy, and with the courage to see beyond the fear that war so often imposes. War does not end when the last missile falls or when the final ceasefire is signed. In fact, some of the most lasting battles begin only after the guns fall silent. The psychological wounds of war run deep, and their effects can extend far beyond the individuals who directly experience the violence. In the Iran-Israel-U.S. conflict, the trauma inflicted by years of tension, attacks, and fear has created scars that are passed from one generation to the next, silently shaping the minds and lives of millions. This is the unseen legacy of war. Trauma that lives on in families, communities, and entire societies long after physical destruction is cleared away. Trauma in war zones often begins in childhood. In areas caught between Iran, Israel, and the geopolitical influence of America, children grow up surrounded by danger. Their first memories may not be of playgrounds or peaceful mornings, but shelters, sirens, and shattered glass. What this does to a developing mind is profound. The normal sense of safety that is so essential for healthy emotional growth is disrupted. When a child lives with a constant threat of violence, their brain learns to stay on high alert. This hypervigilance becomes a permanent state. The smallest sound can trigger panic. The future feels uncertain. Trust in the world, and often in other people, begins to erode. But the impact of trauma does not end with childhood. As these children grow, the emotional injuries they carry influence how they see the world and how they interact with it. They may struggle with anxiety, depression, or sudden anger. They may have difficulty forming relationships, finding it hard to trust others or even themselves. They may see conflict as normal, even inevitable, because it is all they have ever known. And when these individuals become parents themselves, the patterns often continue. Fear, mistrust, and emotional pain can pass silently from parent to child, even without words. This is how trauma becomes generational. The psychological damage caused by the Iran-Israel-U.S. conflict is not limited to one side. In every part of this struggle, people have been touched by the mental harm that war brings. Families in Iran, living under the constant threat of sanctions, strikes, or invasion, face daily stress that wears down their mental resilience. In Israel, repeated missile attacks, the fear of terror, and the knowledge that danger could come at any moment create a society always on edge. And even in communities influenced by American decisions, where wars may feel far away, the psychological effects are real. The uncertainty of global tensions, the images of destruction, the fear of what might come next, all these shape the thoughts and emotions of people thousands of miles from the battlefield. One of the most difficult aspects of war trauma is that it often remains invisible. A damaged building can be rebuilt. A scar on the skin can heal. But the scars left on the mind are harder to see, harder to measure, and much harder to heal. A person may appear strong and composed on the outside, while inside they battle memories that will not fade. A mother may walk her child to school each day, smiling and encouraging, while silently fearing that the child will not return home. A father may go to work, provide for his family, and seem fine, while haunted at night by sounds that remind him of gunfire. These invisible wounds affect not just individuals, but entire communities. They influence how people vote, how they engage with their neighbors, how they raise their children, and how they view the future. Over time, this trauma shapes societies. It can harden hearts, making people less willing to take risks for peace. It can fuel cycles of revenge, as past pain is used to justify future violence. It can create cultures of silence, where people are too afraid or too ashamed to speak about what they have endured. And in the absence of healing, trauma can become a tool for those who wish to continue the conflict. Leaders and groups can manipulate old wounds, reminding people of past suffering to stir up new hatred and division. Yet, even in the midst of such deep psychological harm, there is hope. The human mind is remarkably resilient. With the right support through education, mental health care, community dialogue, and efforts to build understanding, the cycle of trauma can be broken. People can learn to process their pain, to see their experiences not as chains that bind them to past, but as lessons that guide them toward a better future. But this healing does not happen by accident. It requires attention, commitment, and compassion from both within affected societies and from the global community. In the context of the Iran-Israel-U.S. conflict, recognizing the generational impact of trauma is essential for any path toward lasting peace. Without addressing the psychological scars left by war, no agreement, no treaty, no ceasefire will be enough. Peace is not only about stopping violence. It is about healing minds, rebuilding trust, and creating conditions where future generations can grow up free from the shadow of fear. This is a challenge that lies before us, and the opportunity, if we are willing to see it. Every conflict is fueled not only by weapons, but by ideas, by the stories people tell, the images they see, and the beliefs they hold. In the Iran-Israel-U.S. conflict, psychological warfare goes beyond fear and trauma. It is fought through narratives, propaganda, and the shaping of identity itself. This is a battle to control perception, to influence minds, and to determine how entire populations see themselves, their enemies, and the world. The power of narrative in war is immense. Leaders on all sides use words to frame the conflict in ways that justify their actions and build support among their people. They present their cause as just, their people as victims or heroes, and the enemy as dangerous, cruel, or less than human. These narratives are repeated in speeches, school textbooks, media broadcasts, and cultural symbols. Over time, they become part of the collective identity. People begin to see the world through the lens of these stories, often without realizing it. They form beliefs about who is right, who is wrong, who deserves sympathy, and who deserves blame. Propaganda plays a central role in this psychological strategy. It is designed not just to inform, but to persuade, to shape emotion, and to harden positions. In the Iran-Israel-U.S. dynamic, each side uses propaganda to highlight its own suffering and righteousness, while portraying the other side as the aggressor or the oppressor. Images of destruction, of grieving families, of heroic soldiers are shared widely, not only to report reality, but to strengthen a particular version of the truth. The goal is clear: to win the battle for hearts and minds by controlling the story. This battle for perception is not limited to those directly involved in the fighting. It extends far beyond borders. Through global media, through social networks, and through diplomatic statements, the narratives crafted in Tehran, Tel Aviv, and Washington reach audiences around the world. People thousands of miles away from the conflict are influenced by what they see and hear. Their views on the war, on the people involved, and on what should be done are shaped by these carefully constructed messages. The psychological impact of the struggle over narrative and identity is profound. When a person is constantly exposed to stories that present the other side as evil, dangerous, or beyond reason, it becomes harder to imagine dialogue or compromise. Hatred and suspicion grow. Walls, real and emotional, are built higher. People stop seeing individuals on the other side as human beings with hopes, fears, and families of their own. Instead, they see only the enemy as defined by the story they've been told. At the same time, these narratives shape self-identity. In times of conflict, people often define who they are in opposition to the other. A community may come to see itself as brave because it stands up to an enemy, or as pure because it resists corruption from outside forces. These identities can provide strength and unity during difficult times, but they can also limit growth and understanding. When identity becomes tied too closely to conflict, peace can feel like a threat. To make peace may seem like betraying one's own group or abandoning one's own values. The struggle over identity is further complicated by the role of external powers like the United States. As a superpower, America's actions, alliances, and statements become part of the narrative on both sides. In some versions of the story, America is seen as protector of peace and stability. In others, It is viewed as a manipulator, an aggressor, or a force that fuels the conflict for its own interests. These contrasting narratives shape how people in the region and around the world view not only America, but the entire conflict itself. The long-term psychological effect of these narratives and identity struggles is to make peace harder to achieve. When people are deeply invested in a particular version of the truth, they resist information that challenges it. When identity is built on opposition, cooperation feels dangerous. And when propaganda defines a conversation, the space for honest dialogue shrinks. These are not just abstract ideas. They have real consequences, influencing policy, fueling violence, and determining the future of generations. Yet, the same tools that have been used to divide can also be used to heal. Stories have the power not only to justify war, but to build peace. When narratives include the humanity of all sides, when propaganda gives way to honest reporting, when identities are built on shared values rather than division, the psychological walls of conflict can begin to crumble. This requires courage from leaders, from media, and from ordinary people. It requires a willingness to question the stories we have been told and to listen to those we have been taught to fear. In the end, the psychological war over narrative and identity may be the most important battle of all, because it shapes what people believe is possible. And if we can change the story, we can change the future. The true measure of peace after war is not found in signed agreements or silent weapons. It is found in the condition of the human mind, and whether those who live through the conflict can move beyond fear, hatred, and grief to build lives of meaning and safety. In the Iran-Israel-U.S. conflict, as in all wars, lasting peace demands more than a halt to physical violence. It requires healing minds that have been fractured by years of fear, loss, and division. This healing is not easy. It cannot be achieved by force or decree. It is a slow, careful process that asks individuals, communities, and nations to confront the emotional and psychological damage left behind, and to commit to rebuilding not just cities and borders, but trust, hope, and humanity. The first step toward healing is acknowledging the damage that has been done. War leaves behind more than broken buildings. It leaves behind broken spirits. People who have lived through violence, displacement, and constant uncertainty often carry invisible wounds that affect every part of their lives. They may experience anxiety, nightmares, difficulty concentrating, or a deep sense of loss. Their relationships may suffer as they struggle with anger, fear, or emotional numbness. In children, these wounds can shape development, affecting how they see the world, how they form connections, and how they handle challenges. If these psychological injuries are ignored, they do not fade, they deepen, and they can pass silently from one generation to the next, continuing the cycle of pain and mistrust. Recognizing these wounds must lead to action. Healing minds after conflict requires more than sympathy or kind words. It requires real support, mental health care that is accessible and designed to meet the unique needs of war-affected communities. This includes trained counselors who understand the cultural and social backgrounds of those they help, community programs that offer safe spaces for people to share their experiences, and educational efforts that teach coping skills, resilience, and hope. Mental health support must be treated as an essential part of rebuilding after war, no less important than repairing roads or restoring water supplies. It is a foundation on which all other recovery depends. Education plays a powerful role in this process of healing. When children and adults alike are taught about peace building, empathy, and the shared humanity of those they once saw as enemies, they can begin to see beyond the divisions created by war. Education helps people challenge the narratives that fueled the conflict and imagine a future based not on revenge or fear, but on understanding and cooperation. Schools can become places where young minds learn to think critically, to ask questions, and to seek solutions that do not involve violence. Community education efforts can provide adults with the tools to rebuild relationships, resolve disputes, and contribute to peace in their daily lives. In this way, education helps heal the mind by replacing old patterns of thinking with new possibilities. Dialogue is equally essential. The wounds of war are deepened by silence, by isolation, and by the hardening of hearts that often follows violence. Healing requires people to come together, to speak honestly about what they have endured, and to listen, truly listen, to the experiences of others. Dialogue opens a door to forgiveness, to understanding, and to the rebuilding of trust. It does not erase the past, nor should it, but it allows people to move beyond the past, to see each other as human beings rather than as enemies, and to begin the difficult but vital work of creating a shared future. Without dialogue, old wounds fester, and the seeds of future conflict remain in the soil. The international community has a role to play in supporting this healing. Nations like the United States, which have influenced the course of the Iran-Israel conflict, bear responsibility not only for the choices they have made, but for helping to repair the damage those choices have contributed to. This means providing financial support for mental health programs, for educational initiatives, and for efforts that promote dialogue and reconciliation. But it also means setting an example, choosing policies that seek to heal rather than to divide, to build rather than to destroy. Lasting peace cannot be imposed from the outside, but external support can strengthen the efforts of those within conflict zones who are working for peace every day, often in quiet and courageous ways. True healing after war is not a single act or a final destination. It is a journey, one that may take generations. It requires patience, dedication, and compassion. And it requires a shared understanding that peace is not simply the absence of gunfire. It is the presence of minds no longer trapped by fear, hearts no longer hardened by hate, and communities no longer divided by the violence of the past. Healing minds beyond missiles is the most difficult work of all, but it is the work on which every hope for a better future depends. In the end, the Iran-Israel-U.S. conflict reveals a truth that too often goes unseen, that war is fought not only with weapons, but with words, with ideas, and most of all, within the human mind. The missiles may stop, the borders may hold, but the psychological wounds of war linger in the hearts of children who grow up afraid, in the minds of adults shaped by endless tension, and in the divisions that settle deep within communities. This is the silent legacy of conflict. But war psychology does not only teach us about harm, it also shows us where the path to peace begins. If fear can be planted, so can hope. If propaganda can divide, so can dialogue unite. If trauma can break spirits, so can empathy heal them. The work of healing minds, of addressing fear, trauma, and the manipulation of identity is not secondary to peace. It is peace. Without it, treaties are fragile, and the cycle of violence waits just beneath the surface. The true victory in any conflict is not measured by land gained or enemies defeated. It is measured by the ability to break the cycle of hate, to restore dignity, and to build a future where human minds are free from the shadows of war. This is a challenge before us, and the opportunity, because when we heal minds, we do not just end wars, we prevent them